Hello, everyone. How are you guys doing? Welcome to the Community Perspective on Childhood and Adult Obesity series. This is the first of four series, or first of four pieces that we're going to be doing where we try to get the experts in the field of obesity together with the public, right? And we are doing that in a couple of different ways. One way is by having a live studio audience, right, which is you guys are here. And the other way would be to have a call-in, which is a little bit later. So I am Chip Gubera. I am a board member of Cat3 Television, and I am going to be doing the announcing today. Here in a little bit, I'll introduce Dr. Will here, who's going to be giving the talk, right? Before we do that, though, I'd like to thank a couple of people who made this all possible. First off, financial assistance for the project has been provided by the City of Columbia. Let's hear for the City of Columbia, huh? Yes, thank you, City of Columbia. Fantastic. And other people, obviously, is Cat Television, which you're watching on, and KOPN, which you might be listening to at home. KOPN, fantastic. Other sponsors are the Christopher S. Bond Life Science Center, the Department of Psychological Service at the University of Missouri, the Johnson's Management and Counseling, MU's Office of Research, and PedNet, okay? And of course, Science Saturday is also a sponsor. So let's give it up for all the sponsors, huh? Great, great. So how this is gonna work is Dr. Will is going to give about a 30-minute presentation. And then afterwards, we are going to open it up to the audience to ask questions. So get your questions ready. And of course, you viewers at home and on the radio, you can call in as well. I can give you that number right now. And of course, it will be on the bottom of the screen when it's time to do that as well. That number is going to be 876-7236, okay? So this is great. This is a wonderful audience. This is great. So this is Dr. Matt Will. He is an assistant professor and research faculty at the University of Missouri in the Department of Psychological Services. Sciences. Services, sciences. You know, I told you, Mike. Yeah, anyway, thank you. He's a PhD from the University of Colorado in 2000, right? And he has numerous publications in prestigious journals. Many I cannot pronounce if I can't even read sciences, so forgive me. Let's see, his work focuses on using behavioral neuroscience to examine drug addiction and obesity. So, with that, let's give a big welcome to Dr. Matt Will.
All right, thank you, Chip. Great introduction. Thanks for all of you that came here in the studio and all of you tuning in at home. This is a great opportunity to be part of this series on obesity. It's obviously a very important problem, and there's a lot of people working on it. And it's great to share my story and take some of the research out of the lab and bring it to the community. So the title of my talk is Why We Really Can't Eat Just One. And so this is a play off of a very popular commercial back in the day a while ago. And I hope to expand on this slogan. For them, I'm sure it just meant that they created a very tasty potato chip that maybe was a little bit tastier than other competitor potato chips. But for me, I'm going to hopefully expand and give you a little bit more depth behind that phrase and what it means as far as your eating habits, the obesity epidemic, and possibly food addiction. So, next slide. So to understand obesity, or just the regulation of body weight, the simplest model is to just consider energy in, energy out, or another way to put it is calories in versus calories out. And so obviously if you have an imbalance in this, setup, on the next slide, you can see that if we have a decrease of energy input and an increase of energy output, you see a decrease in body weight. And on the next slide, you can see the inverse balance where you increase energy input, decrease energy output, you're going to see the increase in body weight. And it wouldn't necessarily, of course, need to have energy output change. You can have just increased energy input, and you're going to see a body weight change. And the same would go for energy output. So it seems like it's a simple model, and it's very easy to understand how these two components can change body weight. But what the researchers are working on is to understand what all the factors are that go into each of these two sides of the scale. So what are the factors that cause changes in energy input? What are the brain mechanisms that control energy input? What are the brain mechanisms that control energy output? And so on this slide, what we're going to do is see a series across 25 years of how the rates of obesity have changed. And so on this first slide, we're seeing the rates of obesity in 1985. And what you see is some states that are colored in light blue, some that are in dark blue. The ones that are in white have no data. This is back in 85. They just started collecting data, so we have some states that reported no data. In the light blue states, that represents states that have somewhere between 0 and 10% obesity rate. And in the dark blue states, we see a rate between 10 and 15%. And this is all calculated based on the body mass index, which you all probably heard of. So it's a formula based on your height and weight. They come up with a number. So for example, if you have a body mass index of 30, this would be the body mass index of someone that was 5 feet, 4 inches tall, weighed 174 pounds. So this would be considered 30 pounds overweight, and that's the threshold of where someone would be considered obese at that height. So we're going to go through a sequence of slides from 1985 up till 2005, and we're going to see how this obesity epidemic has quickly taken hold. So next slide. So now you see that there's a lot more states that are in blue, dark blue, so we're seeing an increase across the nation. Next slide. Now in 1989, we see a continued increase, 91. Now we have a new category. Now we're seeing some states that have obesity rates that are up to 15 to 19%. Next slide. We see the states continuing. The last holdout state is Wyoming there, doing very well. Actually, that just means no data, so we have no idea how they did that year. In 1995, we see a lot more states reaching that 15 to 19% obesity rate. Next slide. Now, a new category. Now we're seeing in 1997, we have 3 states that have reached 20% obesity across their population. Next slide. In 1999, seeing quite a few states reached into that 20% category. Next slide. 2000. And then 2001, now we have a state that's entered into having 25% of their population considered obese, according to the body mass index. Now 3 states in 2002, then 2003, 2004, and 2005. And if you could go back to that last slide. Now we've got 3 states that have reached into this category of 30% of their state's population having this body mass index of 30 or higher. So 30% of their state's population is obese. And while this stops at 2005, there's data that the Center for Disease Control has collected up through 2008. And you can imagine this state, the entire nation is at least in the orange, and quite a few more have entered into that red category of at least 30%. So this epidemic is continuing. There doesn't seem to be any kind of slowdown. And so you can understand the implications of this. And obesity, as we all know, is more than just a weight problem. It contributes to a higher prevalence of heart disease, diabetes, and other disorders. So you can go to the next slide. So the question is, what's happened to the balance? So what are the contributing factors that have led to this obesity epidemic? So we have possible changes in energy input. We have possible changes in energy output. So what's happened? Have our eating habits changed? Have we changed our activity habits? And of course, the trends are from the data that we see is that there's changes going on both sides of the scale. And unfortunately, the change is in the direction that will, of course, cause increase in body weight. So we have eating habits changing so that we have increased energy input, and we have activity habits changing so we have people exercising less, being more sedentary, which of course with the added calories taken in, that's going to lead to increased body weight. So the question is, what's leading to this? So I'm going to focus on this side of the scale. Certainly a story could be told about what's happened to the activity habits that's led to this. And there's a very thorough story on that, lots of data to support that. And of course, there's the same thing for the other side. So I'm going to focus on the eating habits, as that's what my research is on, and talk about the different brain areas that contribute to eating habits and how they interact with environment and what's changed in the environment. So next slide. So I'm going to look at, I'm going to try to relate to you two different areas of the brain that regulate two types of feeding. And we all know that we need to eat, but certainly the problem of obesity is not caused by just increase in energy needs, right? So we're going to discuss a couple of different neurological or brain areas that control two different types of feeding. So next slide. So we have Joe here who is trying to make a decision of what food to eat. And Joe is going to be controlled by two different areas of his brain in making this choice. And this depends a lot on what context he's in, what his experience has been, and specifically, is he hungry or is he not? So if he's hungry, Joe is going to be more likely to choose the healthier foods, which my family likes to refer to as green light foods. So you have green light foods, those are the healthy foods, vegetables, fruits, and that means green light means go, so you eat as much as you want. And then you have yellow light foods or somewhere in between these, where you take them in moderation. And then you have red light foods, which means stop. You don't really need it. If you want your utmost best health, just avoid them altogether. But of course, it's fun to eat these once in a while. So the pie and the soda, that would be considered red light food. So if Joe is hungry, he's more likely, this goes for other people just besides Joe. Joe represents everyone. So if that wasn't obvious. But if he's hungry, he's going to go for the healthy green light foods. And if he's not hungry, he's eaten these green light foods. He's not hungry anymore. He's full. There's a chance he still might want to eat the other two foods. He might want some pie. He might want some dessert, right? He might want some soda. So there's two different mechanisms. One is controlling the first phase of feeding, where he's hungry and he's going for the healthy foods. And then there's a second area of his brain that's going to control his desire, his craving, and eventually his dependence possibly on these red light foods that in a moment I'll make a case that they're addictive. So next slide. So the two areas of his brain that research has shown regulate these two areas, or these two types of feeding processes, are the hypothalamus, which is a fancy name for a nucleus in the brain that basically asks the question, am I hungry? Right? So the hypothalamus receives signals from the body or from the organism that is telling the brain, is it hungry or not? Does it need energy? It's trying to defend the lowest, defend the set point, so to prevent starvation. So the hypothalamus is involved in, responding and causing feeding to occur when your energy levels are low. On the other hand, the nucleus accumbens, it asks the question, does the food taste good? And this is a very different type of feeding because it doesn't necessarily require the organism or the human to be hungry. So the nucleus accumbens is asking, does it taste good? And of course, those red light foods taste very good. So the nucleus accumbens is more involved in our intake and our eating habits regarding the red light foods, whereas hypothalamus is related to eating the types of foods that are more green light, yellow light. And of course, this is a simple model, and there's a lot of overlap. But these are the two main areas of the brain that regulate these two types of feeding as far as responding to different signals that indicate these two different types of processes. So next slide. So here we have a picture that shows, obviously we're seeing evolution across a very short time period here. But you can see that we learned to walk, of course. And then the last one shows that we really like soda, and of course that's a red light food. So you see that the last person there is reflecting about 35% of our nation, is that we have obesity occurring in 30% of the people in our nation and other developed countries as well. And the question would be, why do we have both types of feeding systems in our brain? So why would we have a system in our brain that evolved to eat red light food? So one theory is that as we evolved, food was not anywhere near as abundant as it is today, right? So there were times of famine, food shortages, and so as we evolved, our ancestors, they could go maybe days or weeks without a meal. So if they come across some food, they finally find a food supply. If you only had the one system that responds to hunger and then shuts off when you reach satiation or you reach that fullness, then you wouldn't have much energy stored to carry you to the next meal. So that's one theory, is that the nucleus accumbens, which is this kind of hot spot for food pleasure, response to these red light foods, this would cause the organism or our human ancestors to eat more beyond that point at which they reach fullness. So you store up the energy. So that's one theory, is that this helped us get past that, that famine, because we stored a lot of energy whenever we came across a food supply. Next slide. And so today, obviously, we have a very different environment. So this is showing a couple things. This is showing the foods that we were surrounded with that obviously did not exist. They're very different types of foods, and they obviously were, these red light foods did not exist. And you can see the portions have changed over time. So this is showing you portions, how they've increased. So not only has the type of food increased, but the portions that are available and provided to humans has changed as well. So these all are contributing to what used to be an adaptive mechanism, which was, if you come across a food supply and it tastes really good, that means it's high in energy, so eat a lot of it, because you don't know when your next meal is going to come. But of course, if you're going to Taco Bell, not to pick on Taco Bell, but if you're going to a fast food restaurant and you get some high energy food, your nucleus accumbens is going to say, that tasted really good. You should just circle around and get some more, right? So the hypothalamus, on the other hand, it has nothing to do with that, not so much. And so the hypothalamus, or this area of the brain that responds only when you're hungry, you get one helping of fast food, and you're not hungry anymore. And so the nucleus accumbens kicks in, and that's responsible for you driving around and around and around and getting more and more food. All right, next slide. So there's a couple implications of this. So we know that it will cause us to overeat of a certain type of food. So it's actually causing us to indulge in the very high energy fattening foods that, of course, would lead to obesity. And another thing that's unique about the nucleus accumbens is that for anyone that's studying drug addiction, that's the first place they look. So the nucleus accumbens and the areas that talk to it in the brain, this is the hot spot for studying drug addiction. And that happens to be one of the spots, of course, that causes us to eat these foods. So this picture is depicting the similarities that actually are taking place between drugs of abuse and, as you can see, a candy bar there. So what I'm going to do in the next few slides is make the case that this ability of these red light foods to activate the nucleus accumbens, of course, it causes overeating, but it also can lead to an addiction, the downward spiral, and all of the bad things that come with it. So next slide. So if you were going to make a parallel between junk food, or these red light foods, and drugs of abuse, a lot of people will say, oh, food's not addictive, food can't be addictive. Certainly it doesn't quite cause the same level of addiction, but as we see, if we want to look at the rates of relapse, or the clinics, say rehab clinics for food disorders, especially overeating types of food disorders, and you consider rehab clinics being similar to diet clinics, and certainly they outnumber any types of drug rehab clinics. So that's one argument I like to make, is that we have quite a few rehab clinics regarding food addiction. But if you were going to ask, well, how does food compare to drugs of abuse? Well, within this area of the brain, the nucleus accumbens, the signals that respond to this junk food when you eat it, that makes it taste so good, actually mimic, or actually they're the same pathways or targets that these two drugs activate. So heroin, we all know that's very addictive. Marijuana, we know that's addictive, that's a drug of abuse. These are, if you inject these substances into that area of the nucleus accumbens, they cause overeating. So the people that study food addiction, such as myself, we actually are mimicking the actions of these two drugs in the brain. And these two drugs are specific in causing increased feeding or binge eating of these high-fat, high-sugary foods. So there's a very strong parallel in the research between the actions of food on the brain, specifically these high-fat, high-energy foods, the junk food, and the actions of these two drugs of abuse. So next slide. So now if we put these two systems head to head, and we think about what the implications of activating both of these systems is, we have the hypothalamus and the nucleus accumbens, and we know that both of them, their job is to increase appetite, but I've described how nucleus accumbens is specifically involved in eating these bad foods, these red light foods, which happen to be high in calories, and is also involved in the addiction process underlying drugs of abuse. And then we have the hypothalamus, which, yes, it's involved in regulating appetite, but it's not set up to preferentially cause overeating of these red light foods. And it also is not associated so much with drug addiction and how that works. So if we put them head to head, who's going to win as far as its contributions to the obesity epidemic? Next slide. Nucleus accumbens by a landslide. So nucleus accumbens is, as at least the data shows, and hopefully I made the case, that the nucleus accumbens and its role in regulating appetite is much more involved in creating the types of feeding habits that we think are contributing to the obesity epidemic. Next slide. And that's why we really can't eat just one. Thank you. So are there any questions?
No, I have one. Come on forward. Oh, can I? Okay.
And if you have a question at home, please call in.
Okay. All right. I kind of got an understanding about the two parts of the brain, but my thing that causes me to go off the deep end is salt. Salt, if I don't use salt, I can eat the amount prescribed and go on. But the same food, if I add salt to it, it enhances the flavor. And I don't feel satisfied till I eat 2 or 3 times as much as the same food. Before that, I felt full without the salt. But with the salt, it takes more for me to feel full because it tastes better and
Yeah.
I eat more.
Right, so salt, that's a good point. So salt, people wouldn't necessarily, throw that in with sugar and high-fat food, but salt is a very palatable substance, and the nucleus accumbens and the opioids, or the molecules that the brain makes that are similar to morphine and the cannabis or the cannabinoids, they actually regulate salt intake. So salt intake is actually more regulated by the rewarding system, which is the nucleus accumbens, than the hypothalamus. So salt is thrown in there with, it's not necessarily a red light
Does
food.
that go on the negative side, the salt?
You need salt, so, but I'm just saying it's a palatable substance, it's a rewarding substance.
Yeah.
So when we do manipulations in our animal research, if we inject morphine into that hot spot in the brain, the nucleus accumbens, it increases salt intake dramatically. So whereas it doesn't do that so much for other types of foods that are less palatable. So salt would be in that category of foods that possibly could activate this system and lead to addiction to some degree.
Right, and cause you to hold on to more water and just on from there.
Right,
Possible heart problems and.
right.
Okay, thank you.
Good question, thank you. All right, so we have a call-in question. Go ahead.
How food is like addiction, and it sounds like, I know that there's drug therapies to treat addiction of drugs. Are there any current drug therapies to treat the food addiction?
So yeah, are there any food or drugs out there to treat food addiction? So we all know that there's actually not the greatest number of drugs to treat drug addiction, but whether or not there's drugs to treat food addiction. And actually, So I had mentioned how the intake of these red light foods is regulated very similar to the way that heroin and marijuana works. And the drugs that we use to treat heroin addiction is to give them a drug that blocks the targets that heroin binds to in the brain. And so one of these drugs is naltrexone, which is referred to as an opiate antagonist. So this blocks the receptor or blocks the target so that heroin or morphine cannot have its action. And this actually has been used, and it works in some people to help treat food addiction. Although the problem is when you're messing with a system that has a lot of other functions, such as opiates do. So you have all the rewarding things that you experience. So anything you can think of that you would enjoy, this is going to have some relation to the actions of opiates. And so if you block that, you're going to have less enjoyment of those activities, as well as less enjoyment of feeding of the certain types of foods. There was an article yesterday in the paper that brought up naltrexone as it was actually effective in treating alcoholism. So alcoholism actually can be treated as well by blocking this opiate receptor target in the brain. And the way they do this, whereas in future trials they actually only were giving the pill and they had to take the pill every day, so it was short acting. So they had, you had to have a lot of self-reliance, self-control on taking the pill. But when you take the pill and then you take the substance of abuse, say it be heroin, alcohol, or a bowl of ice cream, if you've taken the pill, it's not going to taste as good. It's not going to make you feel as good. So, of course, then you're less likely to take it again. So this last drug, they're giving it in a slow release form. So you go to the doctor and once a month you get injected with this drug. And so you rely less on your own self-control, and yet it still blocks the actions of these drugs. And so the idea is that it reduces the rewarding effects of these drugs a little bit, or the rewarding effects of eating these red light foods. So when you eat the ice cream, it's not quite as tasty, so you're less likely to crave it in the future. That was a good question. Thanks. Any other questions from the crowd here?
I'm curious, beyond just the nucleus accumbens, deriving pleasure from the eating, I've heard this argument that isn't there a shut-off mechanism in the brain for eating what they call whole foods? I mean, most people can't drink a gallon of milk or eat 2 pounds of steak.
Right.
A lot of people derive a lot of pleasure from eating steak, and yet a lot of people can eat a bag of cookies, a pound of cookies, eat a gallon of ice cream.
Right.
So isn't there something more to do with the composition of the food itself? I mean, whilst I agree that there's something going on there with the nucleus accumbens,
Mm-hmm.
what about the food itself?
So you brought up a couple good points. The shut-off mechanism. So these 2 areas that I was talking about, I was talking mainly about how they increase our appetite, but I didn't refer so much to mechanisms that control the upper limits, keeping us from overeating. And if you think about how evolution works and what's adaptive, if food is in short supply, then of course the mechanisms required for keeping the eating above the maximum is not going to be required as much. So of course the mechanisms that are most important for the survival of the organism are the ones that defend starvation. And so in the times where food was very scarce, you're going to have more mechanisms evolving to defend that lower point of near starvation. And but certainly the area, and that's another implication of this system the nucleus accumbens regulates, which is the rewarding actions. So you have, not only is it preferentially influencing intake of these high-fattening, high-calorie foods, but it also has less shut-off mechanisms than the other system regulated by the hypothalamus and the signals that it receives.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We have another phone call.
Hello?
Hello, go
Hi.
ahead.
So I had a question as to why the brain automatically diverts from boredom to hunger at the exact same time, and if there's a way to, stop
Right.
that.
Good question. So yeah, I asked my class the other day, I was trying to get a hold on the idea of why people eat when they're not hungry. That was the title of a different talk I gave. So why do we eat when we're not hungry? Well, people say, well, because it tastes good. That's the answer I expected for my class, but they actually said because we're bored. So why do we go from boredom to hungry? Was that the question? Well, he's off. Was that the question? Yeah. Something like that? So that's an interesting thing. So of course, if you're bored, then you're looking for something fun. You're looking for a mood pickup. And so obviously these red light foods that activate this rewarding system, just like a drug of abuse. If you're bored, you're more likely probably to go and search out a drug of abuse to lift your spirits. And so the same thing goes with these foods. And so these foods have a lot of parallels to drugs of abuse. If you're bored, more likely maybe to go for the foods that are tasty. You're not going to go out and eat a head of lettuce. You're going to go out and eat a bowl of ice cream, right? Good question. Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, we have a phone ringing. Any other questions from the audience? All right. Anyone that has a question from the audience can please come up to the microphone. All right, we have a phone call. Go ahead.
Willpower and self-control, or what's the answer? Okay. Go ahead. My question is, what does Dr. Will think the answer is to the obesity epidemic? Is it just self-control at this point, or how does this ever end?
Right. So, what do we foresee for the future? So, is it just self-control? Obviously, there's certain changes in our environment, certain changes in the way we think and approach the context of eating. Self-control is certainly one of them. So what I presented was basically the biology that is going to be working against this. There's a lot of areas of the brain that are involved in the control over environmental events, control over our behaviors, some of these higher order functioning areas of the brain. And these communicate to the nucleus accumbens as well. So we have a lot of these same areas of the brain that are involved in self-control. If they're deficient, they're going to facilitate this actions of the nucleus accumbens and either contribute, or they could help diminish the rewarding effect or the pleasurable effects of these foods. All right, we have one more phone call.
All right, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Lauren, and my question is, how effective has the Wii Fit been in destroying childhood obesity?
The which what?
The game board.
Oh, Wii Fit, right. Well, I know I've tried it myself, and of course, the next day I was sore, and all I'd done was played tennis, a couple games of tennis, which discouraged me from doing it again. I had to maybe stretch out next time. But yeah, Wii Fit, I have no idea. I have no data on that, but certainly I think it's a great idea. It gets people off the couch. At least they're standing. I think you burn more calories when you're standing. But Wii Fit, I like the name, and I like the idea. So hopefully that will contribute, and maybe we'll see. Maybe we could follow where the higher usage of Wii is, and see if their obesity rates go down.
What's your opinion on high protein diets like the Atkins diet?
Yeah, I don't know too much about the Atkins diet. So yeah, eliminate carbs and more protein. So certainly, carbs are associated with. I consider, I think of carbs as including a lot of butter. So a lot of, pasta, where you add butter to that. Bread, you add butter to that. And so I don't know the contribution of carbs versus the types of foods that are associated with it, either sugar or the fats that we know that are very, involved with the nucleus accumbens and how that regulates the intake of that. But the Atkins diet, I think, obviously it's been successful for some people, but I'm not sure exactly how that works as far as the two systems and which one's having more of an effect or which system's being altered more by the Atkins diet. But good question.
Okay.
We have another phone call. Go ahead.
Hey, Dr. Will, how's it going tonight?
Good.
I was wondering if you think marijuana has an effect on the nation's obesity problem? more specifically the munchies that come with marijuana usage?
Right. So yes, that's an obvious segue from the talk. If you had followed the talk closely, you had seen that the actions of, ice cream. If you eat ice cream, what's going on in the brain that is making that taste really good? And one of the chemicals is very similar to marijuana. So it's the natural chemical that your brain produces that binds to the same receptor, the same target in the brain that marijuana does. So marijuana actually, anecdotal evidence and some laboratory evidence shows that you prefer these types of foods, these red light foods. So obviously lead to the contribute to the obesity epidemic. I have not seen any data on correlations between marijuana use and weight gain, but that definitely the data is there to suggest it. But actually, I should mention also that one of the drugs that we thought was going to be, there was always drugs coming along that we think is going to be the miracle cure for obesity. But one of the last ones to be studied and gone through clinical trials was basically an anti-weed pill. So it blocks the receptors of the targets that marijuana would bind to. So the idea was that if you block these targets, food's not going to taste as good. So you're going to have all the opposite symptoms that you would have, that you normally would have under the influence of marijuana. But they did lose weight, but it was maybe 10 pounds over a year. And of course, it had all the same side effects that I talked about when you block the opiate receptors, or these opiate targets. Because these chemicals have a lot of functions. So if you just do a widespread block of their actions, you're going to affect a lot of things besides appetite. So another call in.
Preservatives that have been added to food, specifically gluten, have on the obesity epidemic.
I didn't hear that. Could you ask it again?
Yes. What effect do preservatives, especially, or just add-ons to food that food companies add, especially gluten, have on this obesity epidemic?
Yeah, that's interesting. So gluten, that would be contained in all different types of wheat products. And gluten, some people have an intolerance to gluten. That'd be celiac disease. People have very severe intolerance to gluten. And the question was, what contributions does gluten have to the obesity epidemic? One of the things gluten does is actually mimics morphine in the brain. So you can consider that if, we all know morphine's addictive. If gluten is mimicking morphine in the brain, then gluten obviously could have some addictive properties or addictive potential. And, we all know that the things that, contain gluten would be the, pizza, very high in gluten, right? And we all love pizza, and maybe that would be somewhere between a yellow and red light food. I don't want to make it red light food because I like to indulge quite a bit. So, and another call-in question. Go ahead.
Go ahead. My question concerns hypnosis, and I'm wondering, does that have an actual physical effect on the brain so that hypnosis could actually help people with obesity, or is it just kind of a psychosomatic type thing that makes you think that it's helping you but doesn't really?
So whether or not hypnosis has some alterations or an influence on the brain, certainly hypnosis, I know people personally. I've read a lot of papers on hypnosis, and it has been proven effective. So mechanisms by which it does that, I believe that any type of interaction with the environment is changing your brain. So hypnosis, just going through the practice of hypnosis, going through a hypnosis session, you're certainly having something change in your brain, just as I'm changing your brain as I'm speaking to you right now. So something as simple as just, experiencing light or sound is changing your brain. So hypnosis is certainly changing your brain. In what way it's doing that to, help alleviate addiction, help alleviate depression. That's certainly not known. There's certainly research being done on that. But, if you're addicted to something, I certainly wouldn't eliminate any options. Any other questions?
After you eat that first meal and your brain acknowledges it as rewarding, is there a significance in the difference of the mechanism which like triggers the brain activity as compared, or like taste as compared to anticipation for that meal?
So that's interesting. Yeah. So what's the difference between how the brain reacts to the anticipation of a meal, especially if maybe if it, for example, we'll say a food that's considered a red light food, the anticipation of it versus the actual consumption of it. If there's been prior experience with it, which would then of course lead to expectations, then what you see is you're going to see kind of a head start in what the brain's going to do. And so you do see some of the effects of that you would actually see following consumption prior to consumption based on this expectancy effect. Is that answering your question? Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. We have another call-in question. Go ahead.
Hello?
Hello. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Hi.
Hello.
Do you have a question?
Yes, I was going to ask if there was one diet plan that you recommend to most people.
Whether there's one diet plan I recommended? Well, I have no recommendations that I can give as an expert, but there was some study that came out. We can go back to that original slide where you had the balance energy in versus energy out. So if a weight problem or obesity is as simple as that, then any type of diet plan that counts calories, it's much easier to count well, I don't know if I was going to say it's much easier to count calories in than to count calories expended. But certainly counting these calories that you burn, counting the calories that you're taking in, and keeping a very good record of that, and if you stuck with it, regardless of the type of food you're eating, although, I mean, that would, and Weight Watchers was basically this, the outcome of this study. Weight Watchers was the only diet plans that showed significant weight loss across all participants. And Weight Watchers is based on counting calories. So every type of food has a calorie tied to it. And so people are very aware of it, rather than diets that say shift your feeding habits to a certain type of food. But I would say the main thing wrong with diet plans is that they're viewed as temporary. So obviously you got yourself into this probably through quite a long-term choice and lifestyle change. So it's going to take an equal amount of time to get out of that lifestyle change and to keep that stable. So to think of as a diet as a permanent change, and if it's a grapefruit diet, can you imagine yourself eating grapefruits for the rest of your life? So when you consider diets, maybe think about what you would want to do for the rest of your life. And I think counting calories would probably be much easier. All right, we have another call in. Go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to ask, what is your take on protein shakes?
I like them. Some of them are pretty good. So that's again, I mean, the protein shakes and whether or not, I'm not at all expert on nutrition or diet, the best diets to choose. I'm more expert on addiction. But the protein shakes, the diets that come to mind are these that focus on just having that type of food, and it seems like one of these that short-term cure. Then you go off that. Well, what do you do when you stop drinking these, or do you just drink them the rest of your life? But once again, these are they're high in calories, and as long as you count your calories and don't exceed that limit, which you set for yourself, and you exercise, and you maintain that balance. Anything that maintains the balance from what's gotten you into that position of being overweight or obese is what's going to help. Any other questions? We have one here. All right, go ahead.
Okay. Do you think it's okay to eat fast food even if portion size is limited?
Sure. Yeah. Sure. I think fast food's, You know, fast foods, anything in moderation. So that's kind of my motto. One of my mottos. Moderation in all things. So.
It's always been my notion that perhaps what should be done rather than limiting what you consume is what you do, that more activity is, you can almost eat anything that you want if you are maintaining a very, very active lifestyle, and people kind of are thinking about it on the wrong end.
Right. No, that's a good point. And there's another researcher on campus who actually studies the other end. So he's studying exercise physiology, and he's showing in animal work that you can put, you know, very high-fat diets in front of these rats. Rats love to run, so you can let these rats run in a wheel. They can eat as much as they want of this high-fat diet, and they don't gain weight. Very healthy rats. So it's true that if you have enough on the energy output side, you can have some disregard to a limit of what you're eating. And so obviously, Michael Phelps, right? 12,000 calories a day. And I'm sure a lot of that was red light food. He stayed pretty healthy. Next question.
In relation to what the second caller said, is there something to be said of gum chewing and smoking supposedly making you less hungry?
Interesting. So I've never heard the gum chewing, but there's certainly the actions of just chewing food. They've tried to look at that in some animal research, and whether or not just chewing food, but not letting it actually get to the stomach and digest it and allow the nutrients to get into the bloodstream, whether or not that actually is acting somewhat to suppress appetite. And it doesn't do a very good job. So chewing gum probably is not going to do a very good job of suppressing appetite. Smoking, that's certainly been shown to suppress appetite, but at the expense of all the things that come along with smoking. I'd still rather count calories.
I had a question about these drugs that you use, that you talked about, morphine or heroin and cannabis or whatever. How do those drugs affect normal feeding behavior? So as opposed to high fat, how do they affect eating the green light foods?
Right. So how do these drugs such as, well, when we do manipulations to animals and we try to figure out what systems control which type of feeding processes, this system that's regulated by this nucleus accumbens area and how the signals that it receives, the morphine or the heroin or any other opiate type of molecule or chemical, it preferentially causes intake of these high-fat foods, these sugary foods, foods that are high in salt. So it does have a preferential effect on the type of food. And I don't know if I got to your entire question.
I guess my question is, does it actually affect the green light foods? As in, if
right,
you're
right.
given, say, marijuana, or, I mean, if all you had to eat was green light foods, would you eat more of it because you had the munchies?
Yeah. It does. It increases appetite for all foods. So you'd certainly, if you put lettuce is always it's like the least palatable food I can think of. Very healthy, but if you put lettuce in front of a rat, or they do clinical studies with humans, they give them injections of morphine, and it does increase appetite, and it selectively increases appetite for these red light foods in humans, and of course rats as well. And so regardless of the type of food, the nucleus accumbens has a role in increasing intake of those foods. But preferentially, it has its role, just, it's more powerful in its influence on red light foods. Any other questions?
I heard that the government might start trying to control like portion sizes and stuff in like fast food restaurants. Do you think that would actually solve anything, or would people just buy more of it, like to satisfy themselves?
Right.
Like, or pay the prices.
Right. I think once so whether or not government could control portion sizes, I think they have enough problems on their hands to deal with before they start doing that, and hopefully they don't. But if we could somehow get the restaurant, the manufacturers or the restaurant owners to, all join up and try to regulate portion sizes, that would certainly help. So there was a story, which I think is true, but it'll serve a point at least, is that a certain fast food chain found that people were less likely to come up for seconds, but if they gave them the chance to get, the supersize or the extra portion when they first come through the line, they're going to say yes. So they then they saw that, okay, we sell more food that way. But the idea of controlling portion sizes, certainly, that would be, having someone else count your calories for you. But of course, we would rather control our own.
Like less of an initial meal, and then it would like decrease like their need to have another have seconds. You mean?
Well,
Like
if you could sustain portion control for a period of time, that should alter your brain in a way that would hopefully similar to the way that we treat drug addicts, and that we try to wean them off the drugs slowly. So the same thing with food is if you control portions, you would have to do it for a certain period of time to prevent the relapse or the cycle going back on itself.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Will. Let's give a hand for Dr. Will. I think we can all agree that this has been a very informative talk. So thank you once again. This has been great. And for the viewing audience, the listening audience, and of course the real audience here, this is the first of 4. So check out www.cattv for the future ones. I don't have the dates right now, but they'll be on the website. And let's continue this discussion, all right? Once again, I'd like to thank all the volunteers here at CAT for running the cameras and for working in the sound room and the switcher and all that. So thank you. Thank you to the CAT board. Thank you once again. Big thanks to the City of Columbia for funding this. So let's hear it again for the City of Columbia, huh? Yes. And then let's just one more time. I just want to thank the sponsors. Science Saturday, the Christopher S. Bond Life Science Center, the Department of Psychological Sciences, MU, got it right that time, Johnson's Management and Counseling, KOPN Radio, MU Office of Research, and PedNet. And a big thanks to Dr. Will here, Matthew Will, all right? So thank you all very much, and we'll see you later. Thank you.